Hello, this is Vulturefire, and this is the patch breakdown for the Breach Wanderers patch 6240, which is Aether Storm Part 3. So I am recording this video talking about changes between Part 2 and Part 3. Part 2 has been live for a couple months now, so I'm assuming that most of you watching this are familiar with what the game looks like before this. So lots of changes. Let's get into it. First of all, we have a new area, the Crystal Valley. So the last patch added the Battered Ramparts, which was an alternate area 1, and Crystal Valley is an alternate area 2. When you start a run with a level 2 or higher character, you can choose whether you want to go to Crystal Valley or to the Aether Plains. If you are familiar with the map from the last version, you know how this works. Crystal Valley you could see it, but you couldn't go to it. It had a coming soon label previously. Now you can go there. It has the usual 3 new mid-bosses, 3 new end-bosses, a lot of new normal and elite enemies, new events. All the new normal and elite enemies have their own cards. There's some new mechanics, which I will get into later. And after completing Crystal Valley, if you're playing Depth 3, you'll move on to the Fetid Coast as you normally would if you'd completed the Aether Plains. Of course, if it is Depth 2, then Crystal Valley will be the last area because you only go through Area 2. And that will end your run successfully after you beat the boss of Crystal Valley. So, quick screenshot of just what the area looks like. This is also showing you some of you can see here this idol symbol, which I will explain in a moment. But you can see new background, new enemies. They're very friendly. They love hugs. It'll be great. You'll love getting to know them. Here is the Dama Broodmother, who is one of the new bosses. You can see again, new area, new background, all sorts of good things going on. So the other major new feature here, besides Crystal Valley, is the Shrine. So the Shrine is a new building in town. You get it after you win your first Step 3 run, and it adds additional difficulties to the game. So the Shrine has idols. By default, you won't have any ability to do anything with the Shrine once you first unlock it. I have a series of screenshots to kind of explain things as I go through. So we actually just start with those. So here you can see this is the Shrine right after you unlock it. You can see we can purchase altars, but we do not yet have anything actually unlocked to use. By default, you can buy up to 3 altars. There is a secret Easter egg that will let you unlock the ability to buy up to 5 altars. But that's a bad idea. You shouldn't do it. I'll explain how to do it in another video. And so once you've bought the altars, you can see here that you now have idols available to you. There are 5 total idols, but only 3 will be visible at a time. And those 3 are random and will change after each run, the same way that market items change. There is an option to lock idols, so that if you, for example, want to be able to try against this specific combination repeatedly until you can figure out a combo that works for you, that option is available to you. But by default, they change every run. And you may be wondering, all right, after I bought these, are these just always on? And the answer is no. You have to turn them on before a run starts. So when you're looking at the run screen, you can see here we've got the map up. You can see here is Crystal Valley. So we are on Depth 3. Once you've selected Depth 3, the Shrine button will appear above the Market and Quest button on this page. And when you press that, you'll see a slightly different version of the Shrine. You can see here, now we have the option to invoke idols. We can also just press random, which will pick one of these idols at random to invoke if you know you want to do a 1 idol run, but don't know which one you want to pick. Also, the lock button I talked about that would make it so that the idols will not change after this run, if that is something you want. Once we have invoked idols, we go back to this screen, and you can see now that when you click an area, like the Mushroom Forest, there are 2 idols that are active in this area. So when you invoke an idol, it will give you their passive on all fights. So for example, Idol of the Hunt is the Spear of the Hunt, reducing your fatigue threshold by 1. That means that if Idol of the Hunt is invoked, even if it's not active in an area, fatigue threshold will be reduced by 1. Now, inside a run, each area will be affected by some idols. If you have 1 or 2 idols active, then there will be 1 idol active in each area. So if you only have 1 idol invoked, obviously that idol will be the one that is active in all areas. If you have 2 idols invoked, then it is random which one is in which area. It's possible you could have, say, Hunt and Hunger invoked and just have Hunt in all 3 of your areas and just not ever have to actually deal with Hunger as an active idol. Finally, if you have 3 idols, you will see 2 per area, and they can both affect, and a fight can be affected actively by potentially both of them. And the final boss area will always be affected by all idols active in that area. So if you see here, this is, you can see from the map icons how many idols are active. So you can see here, these 3 fights are all affected by the idol of White Flame, or sorry, the idol of Endurance. And the Spirit Prism boss fight here is affected by both the idol of Endurance and the idol of White Flame. So what does it mean when a fight is affected by an idol? Well, it means a couple things. First of all, it means that at the end of every turn, the idol will play a card, like you can see here. So this is the idol of Endurance doing a card for the turn, which is creating a negative card called an eroded voice stone, putting it on top of my deck. And this is similar to Weather. If you've played Weather fights, you know how this works. Also similar to Weather fights, each idol has a passive effect. For Idol of Endurance, it means that these enemies started the fight with a bunch of Ranks of Fortress. The other buff you can see here is that they have is Lifesteal, which they got because of Hunger's passive effect. So, passive effect that's just always active. So every idol basically has 3 different effects. They have their passive effect that is always active if they're invoked, regardless of whether they're active. They have their combat effect, their combat passive, which is something like adding Fortress to all enemies or adding Lifesteal to all enemies. Basically, all of the combat passives are giving a buff to enemies at the start of the fight. And then finally, you have their active effects, which are a deck of cards that they play at the end of each of the enemy's turns, similar to how weather effects work. Now, the reward for doing idol fights is that you will get offered after the fight. In addition, you see here we have our normal 2 card pool. We have 1 monster card, and we also get 1 idol card. And so every idol has 6 cards, 2 commons, 2 rares, and 2 epics. And they will match the rarity of the monster card. So boss fights will always have epics. Elite fights will have rares, and normal fights will have commons. And so you can choose your fights based on which cards you're looking for. And then also, you will get a bonus that will last for the rest of the run. And you will get 1 bonus for each idol that is active. So in this case, I got plus 15 max health from this fight, but there are a total of I think 22 different possible options. You can get things like additional damage dealt. You can get increased effectiveness of Mighty and Adept and Tough. You can get increased status decay on yourself. So instead of losing 1 status of each type at the end of your turn, you'll lose 3, which makes it easier to deal with that. You can get extra max shield. You get extra shield gained. And then there are a couple that need 2 of the idol rewards. So you have to do a fight where both idols are active in order to get them. For example, fatigue threshold increased by 1 is a possible reward you can get. Another note here is this is only for non-boss fights as an incentive for taking them. You will get the idol card reward in boss fights, but you won't get the extra stat bonuses because this is meant to be an extra challenge. You have to take those fights to begin with. The extra rewards are just so you are incentivized to take these harder idol fights outside of just hitting the bosses. So that's the shrine in a nutshell. I'll have a video that's going through the shrine in more detail up later, but that's it for the moment. So there are also 15 new generic cards. I meant to include some of them in this slide, but you'll just have to use your imagination or unlock them and see what they do. A lot of them summon these new little sprites that are very cute and are kind of smaller summons that are not as powerful as spirits or turrets or the shield generator, but that because they are not as powerful, the cards can summon them for much, much less mana. There's also been a minor card rebalancing, nowhere near as big as the rebalancing in the last patch, but bleed cards were buffed slightly, and 4+ cost cards were buffed because the previous change put a bit too much power in low-cost stuff. So in order to compensate a little bit, the expensive cards were buffed just a bit to help make it easier to justify running things that cost 4, 5, 6 or more mana. So let's talk about the new mechanics. First one, Berserk. Like several of these, this is tied to an idol. Specifically, Berserk is tied to the Idol of Hunger. If Idol of Hunger is active in a combat, then the combat buff from Idol of Hunger will be that all of the monsters will have a permanent rank of Berserk. Berserk cannot be dispelled, and what it means is that if a monster with Berserk reaches 0 health, that monster will not die. Instead, they just lose all their powerful, and at the end of their next turn, they will then actually die. It's worth noting this happens before debuffs take effect. So let's say that you have a monster that has like 1 health and has a bunch of poison. At the end of their turn, Berserk will check, see that they have 1 health left, so they live, and then the poison will deal damage to them, and they will have to spend a turn at 0 health in order to die. That's just always going to be true, is that if the monster was at 0 health, basically when they started their turn, they will not die that turn if they have Berserk. Right now, this Idol of Hunger effect is the only way for monsters to get Berserk. It's worth noting, Berserk enemies cannot be healed, but they can receive buffs or debuffs. This means that, for example, if you have a bunch of Death Spores enemies, so let's say that you're fighting giant Lore Blossoms, and you kill all of them in the same turn, but they're Berserk. The Death Spores will cascade backwards, and if the back one is attacking, you can end up taking a lot of damage from all of that powerful being stacked on it as they die in sequence. It is worth noting that Berserk will not be applied to monsters that are summoned during the fight, only to monsters that start the fight present, which is going to be a relief to you if you are fighting Watcher of the Swarm in Area 3 or Infested Goliath in the Battered Ramparts, because there was a time during the beta when summoned enemies had Berserk, and it was not a good time, let me tell you. Another new keyword, Charred. So if you invoke the White Flame Idol before you start a run, you'll get to pick 2 Charred cards. And by get to pick, I mean have to pick. Charred cards are weaker versions of basic cards like Mend or Slash, and they can't be upgraded or permanently removed. So for example, Charred Mend is a 2-mana heal 9 instead of normal Mend, which is 2-mana heal 12. So Charred cards are kind of a downside. They aren't totally worthless. You do get to pick between 3 options each time when you start your run, but you can't get rid of them. You can't upgrade them. You just have to work around them for the duration of your run. Another new debuff, Crystallize. So Crystallize is a new debuff that increases damage and status dealt to the target. So each rank of Crystallize increases damage and status by 5%. So it is a stacking damage increase on the target. This makes it fairly powerful because most buffs and debuffs, for example, Mighty or Vulnerable, they don't stack. It doesn't matter if you have 100 Mighty, unless you have Mask of Rage specifically. You still will only get the base bonus from Mighty, which is 25%, and there are ways to increase that. But by default, number of ranks of Mighty doesn't matter. Crystallize, though, every rank, 5% more damage to the target. And it doesn't go away at end of turn, but it can be cleansed. The damage and status bonus from it will stack additively with bonus from debuffs like Vulnerable or buffs like Mighty. So if you have Mighty, so you're doing plus 25% damage, and you hit something with Crystallize 2, you'll do a total of 35% damage. Most of the Crystallized cards, as you can imagine, come from the New Crystal Valley area. Also, lots of the monsters in Crystal Valley love to apply Crystallize. So be prepared for that if you're going to the area, that you will be taking... you may want to have some cleanse on hand so you don't take a lot of damage. Another new debuff, Enfeebled. Okay, so Enfeebled is a little bit complicated. It is a new debuff that halves the effects of damage and status modifiers. What does that mean? Well, it means that, for example, each rank of Vengeance will provide a 4% damage bonus instead of 8%. Now, it does also affect flat damage bonuses. So, for example, you would need 2 ranks of Powerful to get plus 1 damage instead of 1 rank. It does affect both positive and negative modifiers, though. So, for example, if you are enfeebled and you are weak, and that is the only thing that is affecting your damage, then instead of getting minus 25% damage from weak, you will get minus 12.5 damage modifier from weak. In which case, being enfeebled and weak is actually better than just being weak, which is a little weird, but that's how it works. It does also apply to both modifiers on the player, such as Mighty, and modifiers on the target, such as Vulnerable. Even though you are enfeebled, it still will make it so that your shock is only worth plus 50% instead of plus 100%. So Enfeebled does reduce by 1 every turn, but you cannot cleanse it off. You can block with Purity, you cannot cleanse it off. So if you are Enfeebled, you're just going to have to wait it out or deal with it. Those are your choices. Right now, there are a couple monsters that apply Enfeebled, but it mostly comes from the new Idol cards. Specifically, the Idol of Cruelty loves to throw out Enfeebled. Another new buff, Lifesteal. So this is a new buff that is also used only by the Idol of Hunger. It is the passive buff of the Idol of Hunger is giving out Lifesteal to all enemies. And when a player or monster with Lifesteal deals non-fixed damage, so just they attack normally, they will heal for 10% of the damage dealt for each rank of Lifesteal they have. So if the monster has Lifesteal 4 and they deal 10 damage, they will heal for 40% of 10, which is 4. If you get more than 10 ranks of Lifesteal or do an attack that naturally has Lifesteal, which the Lifesteal keyword on a card or on a monster attack, not the buff, the keyword, means 100% Lifesteal. So if you combine that with additional ranks of the buff, you can kill for more than the damage dealt. So if you have Lifesteal 4, so if the monster has Lifesteal 4 and it does an attack for 10 damage that has Lifesteal, they'll heal for 14 total. And like I said, yeah, if the Idol of Hunger has been invoked, all enemies will start with a few ranks of Lifesteal. The number depends on the area. And one of the cards that the Idol of Hunger can play in fights where it is active gives the player Lifesteal. This is the only way for the player to get Lifesteal right now, is if you are playing an active Idol of Hunger fight and it has played the card to give you Lifesteal. And Lifesteal is not reduced at end of turn, but it can be dispelled with Arcane. Although it is worth noting that in Area 1 and 2, the Idol of Hunger card that gives the player Lifesteal gives Lifesteal this turn, which is, of course, only temporary, and you will lose it. Another new keyword, Retained. So Retained is a new keyword. It appears on all of the Idol reward cards and a handful of existing generic cards. Calculated Deception, Visions of Frost, I think are the two. Oh, and Channeled Blast. Cards with Retained are not put into the player's discard pile in a turn. You will keep holding them the same way that if you have in it at level 10, you hold tools between turns. What this does mean is that because the most retained cards are not going to be temporary unless you create a copy of them somehow, it is possible to find yourself with enough retained cards in hand that you cannot draw the full 5 cards on your next turn. And because retained cards aren't temporary, that will just block you outright from drawing additional cards. So be careful with that. Try not to go overboard on retained cards. But it can be very useful to be able to hold cards for the turn that you need them. And it's one of the very powerful things that the new Idol cards have. Now, the other keyword that's on... Oh, I didn't fix the wording here. Stasis is a new keyword that appears on all Idol reward cards. And so what Stasis does is it means that the card is going to start each fight in the player's discard pile. And so all of your Stasis cards, they will not start in your draw pile. You cannot draw them on turn 1. They will all be in your discard pile. And they cannot leave the discard pile through any normal means. The only way for a card with Stasis to leave the discard pile is to lose Stasis. So how does a card lose Stasis? Well, at the end of the player's turn, a random card with Stasis will lose Stasis for the rest of the fight and be placed on the top of your draw pile. So what that means is that once a card has lost Stasis and you play it, it still doesn't have Stasis. It can be redrawn again later after you shuffle your deck. You don't have to worry about, oh, if I play this, I'm going to put it in Stasis again and then have to wait. Another thing that this means, because it's random, is that if you only have one Stasis card, you are guaranteed to draw it on your second turn. But if you have 2 Stasis cards, there's a 50-50 chance which one you'll get. So this creates a sort of downside to taking a lot of Idol cards because, especially if you're playing a faster deck, having more than, say, 3 Idol cards is going to make it tricky for you to actually get to them, because to get all 3 of your Idol cards, you have to keep the fight going for 4 turns, which, if you're an aggro deck, you're not really wanting to do. It is worth noting, Frenzy turns still will count for this. So if you have Frenzy and you end your turn, you'll put a card on top, with Stasis on top of your deck, and you'll start your Frenzy turn and immediately have access to it. So another new buff, White Flame. White Flame, also tied to an Idol. The Idol that is tied to the White Flame buff is, surprise, the Idol of White Flame. So this is another one similar to Crystallize that stacks, but instead of being a stacking based on the target, it stacks for the user. So a player or monster will deal 5% more damage and apply 5% more status for each rank of White Flame they have. So if you have 2 White Flame, that's 10%. If you have 4 White Flame, that's 20%, and so on. However, White Flame is combustible. Whenever a player or monster is hit by an attack, they will lose a rank of White Flame and deal 5 damage to all of their enemies. So for the player, you get attacked, you lose White Flame, 5 damage to all monsters. Monster gets hit by the player or an ally's attack. They lose a rank of White Flame, 5 damage to the player and all the player's allies. So this trigger is basically the same as the one for status barriers. If you evade the attack, White Flame won't be triggered, but each hit in a multi-hit attack that isn't evaded will, even if it deals 0 damage. So if you play, Stinging Strike, which is 2x5 damage, that is going to do potentially up. If the enemy has 5 White Flame, you are going to take 25 damage if they don't evade any of those hits. So that is something to be careful with. But it also will mean that they are doing 25% less damage, which could be good. White Flame can be dispelled normally. It does reduce at end of turn, it reduces at start of turn by 1 rank. And it is only triggered by attacks. Fixed damage like arcane detonations will not trigger White Flame. If you watch some of my videos, I recorded most of my videos on older for the beta on patches where White Flame does trigger off of health being lost. So that will be different functionality than you'll see in my videos I'm releasing around this time. But that's how it works now, is that it is similar to status barriers. So that's all the new mechanics. Let's talk about changed mechanics. Arcane. So Arcane got nerfed slightly. Multiple consecutive arcane detonations caused by the same source will only dispel once instead of once per detonation. So if you play a card that applies 40 arcane to an enemy, it's only going to dispel once, even though it triggers 2 detonations. And enemies can still be dispelled multiple times in a turn by playing multiple cards that trigger an arcane detonation. But this means that you can no longer shred all of the monsters powerful by playing a single big Direct to the Rain or Mystical Bloom or Occult Ritual or similar. So the damage on Arcane didn't go down, but it is now much worse it is much harder to just shred all of an enemy's buffs forever by just going heavy into Arcane. So another change, Arcane Leak and Bleed are now removed from everyone at the end of the player's turn, instead of on each thing's turn. This has 2 main effects. The first is Bleed and Arcane Leak on enemies does not stick around between Frenzy turns. So you can no longer, play Bleed plus Frenzy in order to stack up a bunch of Bleed that will carry through from between your Frenzy turns. That doesn't work anymore. But Bleed applied to enemies by Allied Benta, because previously with Allied Benta, what would happen is you would summon your Benta, they would attack, they would apply Bleed, the monster would do their turn, and they would lose the Bleed before you could take advantage of it. Now, you end your turn, enemies lose all Bleed, and then Bentas take their turn, apply Bleed, and so the Bleed will still be there when you start your next turn. So that makes the Bentas a lot stronger. Another change, enemy summoning. The dedicated ally summoning slot is now just a dedicated player summoning slot. This means it is possible for the player to summon an enemy, such as Vengeful Shade, even in fights that would normally not have space for one. And summoned enemies will still prioritize showing up in the space for normal enemies if possible, but they will show up in the dedicated player summoning slot if there's no room. So, for example, if you're playing Shrew, you would previously have problems with fights like Treants or one of the new Crystal Valley bosses, because there just wouldn't be any space to summon a Shade, and you would have to kill. And so if your deck was built around summoning enemies and then killing the enemies that you summoned, those fights became substantially harder because your main mechanic just didn't work for most of the fight. And so that's no longer a thing. You will now always be guaranteed to be able to summon at least one enemy in every fight. However, if you are playing a deck that can summon both allies and enemies, you do still need to be careful not to accidentally overwrite your summoned ally with an enemy. If you have a turret in your summoned ally slot and you summon a Shade that has no room on the board, it will overwrite your turret and you will be sad. Another change. Enemies that are summoned by monster or idol effects now take precedence over enemies summoned by the player, which means that, for example, if a fight is full and a Silga tries to summon another Silga, it will replace a Vengeful Shade or Benta that you have summoned in order to make space. Previously, in particular, this was notable in the Ruby Dragon fight, because you could summon Shades and then take Ruby Dragon to half health, and the Shades would block it from summoning Drakes. and that is no longer possible. The duration will now replace your shades, and you, again, will be sad. And enemy summons that are replaced this way will not count as dying, just the same as allies that disappear to being summoned over do not count as dying. So another mechanic change. Fortress. So I call this a change. It's basically a completely different buff. Prior to this patch, Fortress meant that if you have, say, Fortress 5, then whenever the player gained a rank of Fatigue, the enemy with Fortress 5 would get 5 shield. Now, Fortress reduces damage taken by 10% per rank. So Fortress 5 now would mean you take 50% less damage. It is worth noting, this damage reduction is subtracted from any bonuses or other effects. So if the enemy is vulnerable, which is plus 25% damage taken, they have one rank of Fortress, minus 10% damage taken, total modifier is 15% damage taken. It's also worth noting there is a soft cap of minus 70% total damage reduction. And additional reduction below that is massively reduced. So if the monster has Fortress 10, it's only going to have damage takes reduced by 77%. It won't be minus 100% damage. You still can damage things that have 10 Fortress, which is relevant because the Idol of Endurance applies a lot of Fortress, especially in Area 3. So another note here is that Fortress only affects damage. It does not affect status. And it is also relevant that even though there is a cap, if the total is below 70%, that vulnerable, for example, so if it has Fortress 10 and vulnerable, it is still minus 75%, which will be adjusted to slightly above 70%. The 25% plus doesn't affect the capped number. So you determine the total of all bonuses before you figure out whether or not it's below 70% and do that soft cap. Another mechanic change, Frozen. So first thing, when a player monster becomes frozen, they now gain 2 ranks instead of just 1. Now this may seem like a problem because, of course, before this patch, each turn of frozen meant a turn missed. But now, that's not quite what frozen does. Instead, when a frozen monster has its action triggered by a player card or by opportunist, it will lose a rank of frozen. And also, when the monster tries to act on its own turn, it loses a rank of frozen. And 2 ranks of frozen are lost at the end of turn instead of 1. Which means that basically monsters will always, if you freeze a monster, it will get 2 ranks of frozen and then it will lose both at the end of its turn. So for monsters, this will largely be the same unless you're triggering their actions. You can no longer use frozen to get you an infinite number of free action triggers or to just get out of jail free against opportunist. Players also will, but the other important thing here is that players no longer lose their entire next turn while they're frozen. Instead, if you are frozen at the start of your turn, or at any point become frozen during your turn, you will see that all the cards in your hand will have a frozen visual effect applied to them, and each card you play while frozen will not cost you any mana, but it also won't do anything besides using up a rank of frozen. This will also be true of active triggers you try and use because they are cards. So you freeze, you play a couple of cards, effectively requiring you to choose which cards. Effectively, you're kind of being frozen means you discard 2 cards. Or again, you do lose 2 ranks at the end of turn. You can choose not to play any cards if, for example, your cards are retained, and then you just will not have to worry about that, and it can functionally be the same as it was before. So this means that, so one of the things that happens to this patch is you will find yourself getting frozen by monsters more often, but it won't be anywhere near as devastating as it was on the last patch, where being frozen, especially being frozen 2 turns in a row, could be absolutely game-ending, run-ending, because you would just lose 2 turns, the monsters would demolish you, and you would have a very bad day. And so now you will not have a great day. You will have to give up 2 of your cards from your hand, but you won't just lose the fight because you got frozen. Speaking of frozen, another mechanic change, Ice Eater. So it's now a completely different buff, and it is still only found on Frost Gorgons in specifically Aether Plains. So if you do not remember what this buff is, if you're like, I've never seen this, don't worry. It's very rare. I'm not surprised you don't remember it. So now, instead of providing damage bonus against frozen enemies, Ice Eater means that the owner will get powerful 1 whenever one of their own enemies is frozen. So what that means for the Frost Gorgon fight is that the Frost Gorgons will get powerful 1 each time the player or a summoned ally gets frozen. So this means that the Frost Gorgons will now scale up in damage over time if you get frozen. This seems like a buff that could be a lot of fun for the player to have, but there's currently no way for the player to get this buff. So we'll see what happens in the future. Another change, Opportunist. So this is kind of related to the Frozen change, or similar to Frozen change, in that now each rank of Opportunist is now only a single extra action. So if you have a monster with Opportunist 1 and you draw enough cards to trigger Opportunist, they will do their action and then cycle actions, and then they lose the rank of Opportunist. So it will no longer have Opportunist, and it will not get to do anything to you if you get more fatigue after that. Also, another change is that if multiple monsters have Opportunist, only the front one will take an action when Opportunist is triggered. So you don't have to worry about hitting fatigue and then... So Idol of the Hunt, the fight effect is that all enemies will have Opportunist. And so this change means that you won't have to worry about hitting fatigue and then every single monster in the fight takes a swipe at you. Only the front one will. Same deal with multiple allies having Opportunist. There is a summonable ally with Opportunist now. Only the front one will take an action when Opportunist is triggered. And then it's worth noting, if there is an ally and an enemy with Opportunist, both the front monster and the front ally will get to take their action. Another thing is that instead of losing 1 rank of Opportunist at the start of turn, instead monsters will lose half of their ranks rounded up. So if they had 3 ranks at the end of your turn, they will start their turn, they will lose half rounded up, which half of 3 is 1.5, rounded up is 2, and then so it will go from 3 ranks to 1 rank. So same amount of loss as Poison has, just doesn't actually do anything when it is lost. It only does things when it triggers. Another change, Pack Tactics. This one's pretty straightforward. Previously, Pack Tactics was +1 damage per ally per rank. It is now no longer scales in damage with each rank. Instead, it's just +2 damage per ally if you have at least 1 rank of Pack Tactics. Pack Tactics 3, just as effective as Pack Tactics 1. It's just that Pack Tactics 1 means you only have 1 turn of it. That's all it means. Another change, Predator. Predator now also increases status applied by 10% per debuff on the target. So that's the same bonus you get already with damage, and now it just applies to status as well. And another change, Sturdy. So prior to this patch, the shield gain from Sturdy was similar to Growth, where it's +1 per 6 ranks, and it was just a flat shield gain. So if you would gain 4 shield, and you had the max Sturdy bonus, which was +4, then instead of getting 4, you would get 8. And that meant that it was equally effective on small shields and big shields. And it kind of led to this weird bias towards playing cheaper things like Pocket Shield or Mana Shield that you could potentially play multiple times instead of actually using bigger shield cards. So to kind of incentivize using the bigger shield cards more with Sturdy, Sturdy now gives +2% shield gain per rank up to a max of +50% at 25 or more ranks of Sturdy. So that means that if you would gain 10 shield, instead you gain 15, which is 5 extra from Sturdy. But if you would gain 4, then you only get +2, which is, much less exciting. So this does stack additively with a penalty for Frail, which means that if you have 25 Sturdy and you have a rank of Frail, and you have Frail, then that means you have +50% shield gain from Sturdy and -50% shield gain from Frail, and those cancel out. And so 25 Sturdy effectively means that you just get normal shield until you run out of Frail ranks to cancel. Any shield gain to bonuses from idols or equipment will apply after Sturdy. So if you have a card that says gain 10 shield, you have 25 Sturdy, and you have an item that gives +2 shield gained, you'll get 50% more than that 10 from Sturdy, so that goes to 15. And then you'll add 2 to that 15 from the item for a total of 17 shield. So that is all of the mechanic changes. There are some other changes that I do want to talk about that are specifically character changes. So we have the Drophus passive has changed. Drophus' level 1 passive now only creates blood bursts for you when you lose 3 or more life. And this is largely to fix how incredibly powerful having bleed 1 on Drophus was. Or fighting enemies with Reflect 1. In both of those cases, Drophus could just kind of machine gun out Bloodburst as long as she had mana, which was slightly unreasonable, really. But now you do need to lose a little more life. This is not going to be a huge difference, but it will come up. In some cases, it closes some of the abuse that was possible. Also, there were a couple of Drophus cards that previously lost less than 3 life, most notably Life Tap, which used to be gain 3 mana, lose 2 life, is now gain 3 mana, lose 3 life, so you will still get your Bloodburst. Another change. New Salon tools. So Salon's level 4 still generates a random tool whenever you shuffle your deck. It's just that now he, in addition to the Healing Potion and Flash Bomb, he now generate a Scroll of Defense or a Hidden Pocket. And these are 0-cost temporary cards with the tool type. But despite having the tool type, Inna cannot create them, and neither can any of the cards like any of the effects like Bag of Tools or Dig Through Muck that just say create tools. They will not create Salon's tools, and that's true of both. That was already true with the Healing Potion and Flash Bomb, and it is still true with Scroll of Defense and Hidden Pocket. Finally, Shrew has changed. So Shrew's level 4 passive used to give non-temporary evasion when you kill an enemy, and now it gives temporary evasion. The powerful is still non-temporary. You can still use that to build up powerful, but you can no longer stockpile crazy amounts of evasion and use that to kind of float through fights. You have to be a bit more judicious about how you do things. The level 7 passive has also been nerfed. Previously, Shrew's level 7 passive would transfer all of the debuffs that an enemy has to another random enemy when they die, and now it only gives half rounded up. So if an enemy has 1 rank of vulnerable, they'll pass that on. If they have 10 ranks of vulnerable, they'll pass on 5. So that's how that works now. So I finally do have a list of just smaller changes that I wanted to run through that didn't deserve their own slides. Some of them are high impact, but I didn't think they were worth spending a whole slide on. So there are 2 new events you can find in the Battered Ramparts. So that's fun. Another thing, now if you choose to skip an upgrade or removal, you will be given a reroll token. So if you are like me and you hate thinking when you are leaving bosses, then you can be rewarded for not thinking. And so you skip your removal and you get a reroll token that you can use later to try and force a card that you want to find. You can also now include up to 50 cards in your starting deck. The other restrictions are still the same, only up to 2 copies of each card, only commons in your starting deck, and the card pool hasn't changed, but your starting deck can now have up to 50 cards. You'll see in a lot of my videos after this change that I am often running like 14 to 15 cards in my starting deck for 3 plus idle runs, because I think that is... I find that it's hard to fit everything I need in the 12 starting cards. Another note, the maximum number of decks per character has been increased from 10 to 16. Most of you probably weren't aware that there was a limited number of decks you could have for a single character, but there is, and it's higher now. The tooltip for buffs and debuffs is now divided into multiple pages for better readability. This is especially relevant on mobile, where if you had an enemy that had, like 10 buffs and debuffs combined, and you press them, you would have just this utterly unreadable itty-bitty wall of text, and it is now much better formatted, much easier to sift through. Another note is that cards drawn from a discard pile when meeting a condition no longer cause the deck to be shuffled. So this was mostly relevant for Salon's level 4, where you could use, prior to this patch, you could have used Pocket Shield, which draws whenever you hit 0 mana, and you would repeatedly redraw Pocket Shield, which would repeatedly force the deck to shuffle, which would get you a whole bunch of tools, and that is just no longer a thing that happens. There were also just lots of bug fixes, which I don't really have a list of because my memory is trash on what bugs are in the live patch that have been removed. But that's all for my video, but there's a lot more in the official patch notes. You can see all the changes on all of the cards. You can see all of the details that I didn't think were important enough to include in this 40-minute video. And so that is going to be it for this one. I do plan to record, at minimum, a guide to the Crystal Valley, although I probably need to do more non-idle runs in the valley. I don't have a great handle on all of the enemies there right now because I've done so many runs that were just idle runs. I do plan to do a video about the shrine. I plan to do a short video that I will release alongside this on my channel that is a guide to making bad decisions, specifically in the context of how to unlock access to 4 and 5 idle runs. And that is it. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I'm always happy to answer questions. Also, you can find the link to the official Discord in the description. I'm pretty much always there. The dev is always hanging out in the official Discord, so if you have any questions or you want to lament your fate, that's where you can go. You can also fill out feedback in-game, and the dev reads those. So yeah, that's it for now. I will see you next time. Toodles.